it's really political. It's not about the books. It's about triggering people. They're just going after suburban schools primarily, and it's because they're trying to get the suburban mom vote. At the border or in the inner city, they've hardly had any book challenges. If they really cared, they would care what kids in every school in the country were reading, not just what certain schools are reading. So it's pretty disingenuous, in my opinion. You know, all these anti-CRT bills. It's about racism. I'm Carolyn Foote, a retired, rewired techno librarian and consultant, recently retired from a suburban high school in Austin, Texas, and currently engaged in advocacy for intellectual freedom. I retired in March of 2021 because of COVID and some health issues with my husband, and how Texas was handling it here, I just was like, okay, that's it for me. I was planning on working for a while longer. I hadn't really decided what I was going to do in retirement. I made a list of some ways I could still be active in the profession and do consulting. I had 3 things on my list, and one of them was advocacy. So in September or October of that same year, Representative Matt Krause sent out his infamous letter to superintendents around the state. The letter asked them to audit their school libraries for the possession of any books from the attached list of 850 books. At the time, I had a few colleagues around Texas that were creating conference presentations on how to be prepared for book banning attempts. We'd seen a slight uptick in the spring relating to race and racism. So, being librarians, we all knew many of these books on the list and immediately realized how slanted it was against race and LGBTQ characters. After seeing that, there were 4 of us. We started texting each other that we should do something. Then, while we were talking about that, our governor doubled down with some statement about pornography in schools and libraries. It was so offensive, and we were afraid it would take hold. We couldn't find a common hashtag being used around censorship at that time, so we brainstormed together and came up with one. My colleague Becky texted me the next morning and said, "What if we do a takeover of the Texas legislative hashtag?" She'd seen people talking about doing Twitter takeovers, and I love the idea. We got together with a few other colleagues and made an info sheet for people. Then we secretly notified authors, our friends, and our librarian networks, asking them to participate on November 4th. We kept it all secret, and then on November 4th, we had 13,000 tweets go out. We trended 6th on Twitter, and we were just like, what? What just happened? I was in California on a vacation, and I got up at like 4 in the morning so I could be retweeting things. Since I was not working for a school, I felt like I was a little more at liberty to do that. The Texas legislative hashtag is hashtag TextLeg, and since the hashtag we had come up with is hashtag freedom, which is hashtag capital F, capital R, small EADOM, after that we were like, maybe we should make a Twitter account of our own and make it a website. We started to do weekly Freedom Fridays with things for people to share. Pieces on the power of diverse books with different themes every Friday. Then we did a month-long campaign to get people to write their school board. We designed a shirt and sold it on Etsy, with part of the proceeds being donated to the Texas Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Fund. Today, we have over 17,000 followers on Twitter, and we've spoken to papers all over the country. We've been on CNN. I did an interview with the news in Tibet and on Swiss TV. So it's just been a mind-boggling journey. My role became sort of the spokesperson along with Becky. A couple of our members have to be more non-disclosing because of their jobs, and one member even had to drop back. But I do a lot of the interviews and stuff because I work part-time. I'm doing contract work and have a very flexible schedule. So that's where we are today. We sat down and wrote goals at the beginning. That was my colleague's idea. So we kind of had a clear mission, and although we creep out of it from time to time, we try to stay in that lane. That was my colleague's idea, to have a mission and goals. She's a district librarian, and I'm so glad she did because it helped us sometimes when we kind of get out of our wheelhouse to go, no, this is where we are. Our primary goal is to uplift and provide hope for school librarians, teachers, authors, and students. And we do that by providing information on our website about what librarians do and information for community members to use in advocating, like how to speak at a school board meeting. We have templates for letters to the editor. A student wrote a thing for us on what students could do. Our goal was really coalesced very tightly around that and putting sunshine on what's going on so that people were aware that it's happening. We have found that so much of what's happening, people can't speak up about. We've become a conduit to the media because people will tell us this is going on in our district. In particular, there's a lot of soft censorship going on inside of districts this year, and that's only revealed if people tell someone about it. One of the things about Texas is, because there's no union, there isn't one organization that every teacher belongs to. And people are fearful for their jobs because each district might handle it differently. I mean, there are official organizations like ALA and the Texas Library Association, and we never wanted to step on them. But our goal was really to be more grassroots because we could be more agile.
How much negative feedback have you received?
So, it's strange. Each of us has had negative feedback in our own districts, even me, who's retired. Accusations of being a groomer of students when I literally haven't been in a school for almost 2 years now. The first time I was called a sex groomer and pedophile, I was shocked. It was someone locally too, so it made me very anxious and nervous. Is this a hate group? Is someone going to come after me? That kind of thing. But now, I'm just like, yeah, whatever. I'm grooming my dog because it's just so overused now. But it's very scary when somebody says that to you. Librarians are used to being appreciated by parents. For example, when I was teaching, there's a certain percentage of parents that are going to be upset with how you graded their child's paper or what grade their child got. But as a librarian, you tend to get a lot of positive feedback and not very much negative feedback. So it's a hard transition to suddenly become an enemy. Pedophile is a common accusation that we're trying to sexualize their children. Indoctrinate, that's another common one. We're trying to indoctrinate children. Activists, that we're activists. There was a headline in Texas Scorecard. When we won an Intellectual Freedom Award, it says, activist librarians win award. It was like, okay. And then weaponizing, like filing Freedom of Information requests. I have colleagues whose LGBTQ status has been repeatedly called out by parents in private Facebook groups or publicly and have been denigrated for just being LGBTQ in the first place. That also happened. So lots of harassment on Facebook. I always tell people this whole notion that we're indoctrinating students in Texas when probably 50% of teachers, if not more, vote conservatively is ridiculous. They're just acting like all educators and all librarians vote liberal. That's one of the things about a walkout. You have to have people's agreement. You've either got to have every teacher walk out or every student walk out. You can't just have 5 walk out because then they get fired because we don't have a union to protect us. We did a survey around September, and we had people from 45 states respond to our survey. So we're obviously having a bigger reach than just Texas. When we started this, we knew there might be some censorship, but we had no idea that districts are rewriting their policies for the first time in 40 or 50 years. Of the harassment, the attacks on LGBTQ students and their families, of the state laws being changed, Schools not being able to have book fairs in Florida or bring a book from home. We just had no idea it would get this bad because we felt like someone would file a lawsuit or existing Supreme Court rulings would stop it. But everybody's afraid to sue because they're afraid of the current court. They don't want to have Pico versus Island Trees overturned. Even if the ACLU gets involved, they file civil rights complaints because that goes to the Department of Education. And they told me they feel like that's a more successful route.
What was the Pico versus Island Trees case?
The Pico v. Island Trees suit is from the 80s. A student, Stephen Pico, sued the Island Tree School District because they had removed a bunch of books, including Slaughterhouse-Five, Brave New World, stuff like that. The Supreme Court ruled in a split decision that libraries are voluntary marketplaces of ideas and that students had free speech, and as such, they should be able to pick the materials they read. So while school boards can't include materials that don't meet community standards in terms of explicitness, they also can't just remove materials because they disagree with the ideas in them. But that's obviously happening. States have passed these critical race theory bills, and schools don't exactly know what they can and can't keep. Even though books about racism are not explicit, they're still being challenged and removed. In the past, these suits have typically been resolved favorably for libraries. An important distinction is that the ruling only protects school libraries. It's different with instructional materials in classrooms because they're not necessarily voluntary. And I think the other difference is librarians tend to be sort of part of the leadership team at a school. Even if they're not on the main leadership team, they're still the only librarian, so they're considered more on that leadership level. Whereas if you're just a random art, math, or social studies teacher, you don't have that platform. So unless your whole department stands up with you, it's difficult. Librarians are more willing to go, yes, this is a violation of civil rights, and reach out to the ACLU, whereas an individual teacher is much less likely to even try to take an action because they don't feel like they have that much power. There's a bill pending right now to remove the protection from the penal code that protects educators. If that passes, we're going to see devastating amounts of censorship. I mean, that's what happened in Florida and Missouri, where they passed that criminal penalty. There's certain criteria for determining if an educator violated the penal code. So one is, a work has to be void of any literary merit and be prurient and meant to arouse. 2, if you're an educator, legislator, or I think medical person, you're allowed to share materials in the course, if it's in the course of your job. So a librarian handing a kid a book is in the course of their job, so they're excused from penalty because it assumes positive intent on the part of the educator. Now, this particular part of the penal code is really about more mature material. So if you were teaching The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, there's a rape scene. A parent could file a charge and say, that's explicit. This educator gave this to my child to read in English class. And while the code still says the material must be prurient in nature and be meant to arouse, if those protections are removed, that parent could file a lawsuit. And in conservative areas, they're going to overreact. Ultimately, those parents may not win, but it's not going to prevent them from filing charges. Sometimes it penalizes the school district, but at least one state has a jail penalty for teachers, like up to 5 years. That's why some school districts are being very reactive to that legislation. They want to take educators out of that protected class. which means they would be subject to whatever criminal penalties the various bills propose, like fines or withholding money from the school district. It's amazing, though. I worked with conservative librarians, and while everybody thinks of it as a partisan issue, there's lots of conservative educators who are against book banning too. They don't really think of it as a partisan thing. I just think it's in a librarian's DNA that we think kids should be able to read books and should be able to read books about their own lives. And if you believe that, then you don't think that those books should be removed. And we librarians are all educators first. In Texas, you have to have taught for 2 years before you get your master's and become a librarian. So we feel protective of our students, just like classroom teachers do, and we wouldn't want the needs of our most vulnerable students to be denied. And also librarians, whatever your partisan stance is, are readers. We know what books are being withdrawn when people put out these lists. We know those books. And while there may be a couple of books on a list that maybe someone thinks, oh, that's too much for my district or for me, there's lots of books on those lists that shouldn't be on any list. And so I think librarians of all stripes get that. I personally feel that there's a lot of factors motivating the book bans. COVID certainly entered into it because parents got more involved with what the kids were learning, or just frustrated because of virtual learning and started interacting with their school boards more. But I also think a lot of it was politically driven, because in Virginia, there was a controversy over the book Beloved that became part of the governor's race. And the Democratic candidate sort of muffed his response and said something about parents, that they shouldn't decide or whatever. And then the gubernatorial candidate just took off with that and raised that banner of parental rights, and he won. So then nationally, other Republicans said, this is a winning issue. That really pivoted it into the political sphere. I also think it's just this weird timing. So in 2021, we were coming out of George Floyd, and people around the country really were legitimately, I felt for really the first time since maybe the civil rights movement, were coming to a reckoning and going, I need to read more. I need to learn more. I'm not doing as well as I should in how I speak about race. People were forming book clubs, and I was part of one at our public library. Black Lives Matter came along, and then all of a sudden, that became political, and people started pushing back about Black Lives Matter. And then they started pushing back about books about race. And then they got melded with the whole Christian nationalist, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in Texas when our list of 850 books got released. The whole LGBTQ part of it kind of came out of left field. That representative who released the list was part of a Christian nationalist group in North Texas. And so that was an agenda item for them, really. And I think that caught everybody off guard, to be honest. We were prepared for the pushback on books about race at that point, but not LGBTQ. And then it just took hold. I keep thinking our kids are going to the global marketplace, right? Especially now, when half the students will be working on Zoom with people from across the country. They could be working from anywhere and for anyone. We're not doing them any service, putting them in this protective bubble as if they're never going to leave our communities. They need to know about history and how to get along with people different than themselves and have empathy. We're depriving them of that opportunity. So it's just a really sad and unprecedented moment in this country. The thing that's so hard to get out there in the messaging is it's really political. It's not about the books. It's about triggering people. They're just going after suburban schools primarily, and it's because they're trying to get the suburban mom vote. At the border or in the inner city, they've hardly had any book challenges. They're in a whole different world than the rest of us in the state. The book bans aren't a winning argument in an urban school or a more multicultural school necessarily, but it is an argument that works, in the less integrated suburbs of the country. If they really cared, they would care what kids in every school in the country were reading, not just what certain schools are reading. So it's pretty disingenuous, in my opinion, You know, all these anti-CRT bills. It's about racism. You can't remove books about how Roberto Clemente suffered racism in his career and say, well, that book can't be in a school because it's racist. I mean, it's what happened to him. It's his biography. You can't just say his life didn't happen the way it happened, or we aren't going to look at that part of history. I find it really disturbing. Now, when I was first a librarian in the 90s, there was kind of a wave of anti-witchcraft stuff. I remember pulling our books on the Salem witch trials because someone was concerned about it. I mean, we didn't withdraw them, I just looked at them. What do we have on the shelf? But we didn't really receive any complaints. And I think it's partly because social media didn't exist then, so it couldn't just spread like wildfire. I know that people get sensitive about these stories appearing in the media and drawing attention to their own district. But my personal opinion is these are public school districts. So the public deserves to know what's happening in their school district, and that shedding light on these things will illuminate them. It's important to have these stories told because we're going to look back on this moment in history one day and go, how did all this happen? What happened? Because in a normal year, there might be 300 or 400 books challenged nationally. And this year, I'm sure it's going to be over 2,000. Last year, it was like 1,600 or so. It's surprising how many people don't know any of this is going on. I talk to reporters who have no idea this is going on, and they're reporters. That's why we do every interview people ask us to do, because that's the only way to keep getting the word out. I think our group is more symbolic. We're a symbol that someone is out there fighting. Even if we're not changing things that much ourselves, when you give people more hope, then they're maybe going to be more energized to go fight something, somewhere else, you know? That's one of our missions, is to provide people hope. It's a phenomenal, unprecedented moment that we're in. We may not be able to prevent what's happening, but we can at least get the story out there in the current moment and tell people what's actually going on. It gives you a sense of empowerment if you can at least do that.